There we go. I guess I just didn't click the button hard enough the first time or something. Okay, now you're ready to go.
Okay, I think we're starting with conversation 9, picking up from where we left off last time. Conversation 9 is the way, the truth, the life. And if anyone has any initial thoughts, there, I'll kind of make space for us to share that. Otherwise, I'll just kind of start motoring through based on my notes, and we'll see what arises from that.
Well, this ought to be something easy for Lynn to explain, right? She's had trouble with this before.
Yeah, this is the one that I have often had trouble with. So
Not that I haven't, yeah.
yeah, not that other people haven't. So I'll look forward to hearing what you have to say about it, Jonathan.
So basically, this picks up with Jesus speaking to his disciples alone just before his arrest. And the author talks about the literary construction being no less real than the literal, I think is how he puts it in John. Um, the experiences of the risen Christ by his followers was as real as the world or the words spoken by Jesus. So the idea of the scene kind of being the anticipation, I think, of how Christ will be interacting with his followers more on the eternal and the universal level. He talks about that's dealt with a little more plainly here. The he refers to whatever the disciple John literally heard Jesus say at the end of his life. We find here more fully in literary construction being conveyed. And I think that that's one of the unique elements of the gospel according to John is you deal more with that concept of the resurrected Christ than maybe you have in the other gospels. And of course, that's relevant to us here today as well, because we're living in the same period effectively between the, I guess you could say, first and second Advents. Since it's Advent, we'll say that. And so the idea is addressed of people who are Jesus' disciples being known for their love for one another. We have here as well Peter's betrayal as his means of living through the arrest, which is essential. Like he wouldn't have really survived this whole time period probably if he had not done what he did as far as his betrayal, which was foretold by Christ. But of course, Peter's survival was essential to ultimately the survival of the Christian movement. I thought this was interesting. The author points out that it's going to be belief that will see the disciples through, but belief here is the equivalent of trust, not the acceptance of particular ideas, like a doctrinal list of things that necessarily need to be believed or accepted, but rather a trust in Christ, a trust in God. Talks about in Christ, the word there, T-H-E-R-E, in God's house is here, H-E-R-E, with us now. Many houses, as varied as the people with whom God dwells now. So that passage, I think, dealing with the idea of the houses. To know Jesus is to know the Father. That is part of this this conversation as well. The destination and the way are the same, I think, is one of the ideas that he articulates. And probably that was one of the more difficult ideas that were articulated by Jesus. The idea of to know me is to know the Father. Jesus being equated with God would have basically been blasphemous to the Jews. I think that Christians today we're so used to the idea of Jesus being God incarnate. Some forms of Christianity state that very categorically: God incarnate, man divine. That it isn't maybe a very shocking notion, but at the time in question in Judaism, it would have been a really heretical notion for somebody to say that they are the Son of God, or that they are, for people to claim about a person that that person was the incarnation of God. And yet in John's Gospel, we have that sense that to know Jesus is to know God revealed in flesh and blood. And that's a pretty revolutionary idea. Obviously still is, but at a time when the only comparable notions in the world at that time would have been within the religious traditions of different pagan cultures. You had the idea that gods might have human or semi-divine children, Hercules being one. A human, though, that had divine attributes, superhuman strength or longevity or something like that. So that idea was present in the ancient world at this point, but it certainly would not have been present among the Jews religiously. And so I think that that's a pretty powerful idea, as well, and both today and then. But you can also see how by this point you're starting to lead up to the things that ultimately led to Jesus being executed after a considerable amount of time agitating the wrong people, particularly the religious establishment of his day. You also have the episode here where Peter draws his sword and strikes the high priest's slave. And Jesus, addresses that: "Put your sword back in its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" It's not for Peter to lay down his life for Jesus through an act of violence. Jesus is about to lay down his life for all. And I think that that also cuts into the idea of the question of, the peace testimony, and the idea of, I always think of the peace testimony with this episode, because you have this, I think this has been used at times for grounds of physical violence not being the way of a disciple that's attempting to follow the teachings of Christ. He's being arrested, he's being taken, but he goes willingly in a situation that it's like he's aware what's about to happen. He's kind of told the disciples what's going to happen, but it's not really, I don't really think that they don't really understand the full implications of that. And that's something I've always found interesting at this point in the account, is the idea that there's still maybe there's a vagueness on their part, I think, about what's going to happen and why it's going to happen. And I've always wondered, why was that not made explicitly clear, by Jesus? If there was going to be this entire process, I have to die, it's like he was telling them, he was alluding to it, they really weren't getting it. So it's fascinating to me, because it feels like a rough way to start off a new religious movement that you're expecting to continue after your death, which is a very intellectual, human way of conceiving it. And I've always, I guess, felt that the message is supposed to be that Christ would have been well aware of how all of these things were going to pan out, into perpetuity, I suppose. And he wouldn't have been thinking of things in those ways. He would have known what was going to happen with the day of Pentecost and so on and so forth thereafter. But I might just kind of put out there for anyone else's thoughts on that point, or any others related to kind of what I've been talking about up to this point in this conversation, the material that comes out about Peter and just the concept of to know Jesus is to know the Father. That's kind of it's a big ticket item. That's a big claim for a person to make.
Sylvia, you're muted.
Draining my resources. I am. I think that I've been on the premise that that when Jesus came on earth, he really was trying to set people straight on what kind of a God they had. They had misunderstood for so many years and so many centuries what God was calling people to and what he wanted us to be and do. And all of a sudden he shows up and he said, let me get things straight with you people. And you've not always understood it the way God intended. So here I am to give you that message. And I feel fine about that. Dan and I were having the discussion about how necessary is it to have the Old Testament in with the New. There's so many places where it seems to be that the coming of Jesus was prophesied, that somehow they knew something was going to happen. Would we have accepted just the New Testament without having that all that background, all that prophecy, all that prediction, all that misunderstanding? So before the skies opened up. Yeah.
I wonder too sometimes, I hear what you're saying, Jonathan, about, how clear could he have made it and they still didn't get it. But I wonder how much of it, our point of view has to be influenced by the fact that we already know the end of the story, not the end of the story, but the next big event. And so it seems pretty obvious to us what it was that he was saying. But I wonder, just trying to imagine myself back in that situation, whether I would have gotten it either. I obviously don't know, but it makes me be a little easier on the people who didn't get it. If I try to put myself in that situation and wonder if I would have either.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the episodes where he said things like the tearing the temple down and all the analogies he was giving to his death, but it's not like the concept of someone dying for the sins of the world and resurrect. It's not like that's something that had been going on routinely up to that point, So I do think it's something so unbelievable once it's all taken place. I think that makes a lot of sense. What you just said is, it's like any of us in that position, in that culture, in that time, that reality, it would have, you doubtless would have been someone who would have had a hard time understanding it, and we still do, today as well. I think that's part of the mystery of all of it, to be sure. And I think that that's something that we continue to wrestle with, or at least I certainly do today, because it starts to lead you into questions of a lot of the the traditional doctrines of Christianity, and that's sometimes hard to get your mind around as well. Let's see. I made a note that the idea of practical works of love are a basis for a living faith. He addresses that. The actions that bind the disciples together and with Christ lead to conflict with the world, that there's an inherent conflict between the life that Jesus is advocating and teaching and living in accordance with that. It's really not leading anywhere but some ultimate points of conflict. it ended with his own execution. So obviously it wasn't going to probably end much better for a lot of the other people following him. I know he addresses as well the idea of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, the peace of the world, versus the Pax Christi, the peace of God and Christ. I think that you definitely see that they kind of they conflict with one another ultimately, because the idea of the Pax Romana being that this great benefit of the Roman Empire being part of it was that it guaranteed stability, it guaranteed peace, trade. It was a more advanced culture in terms of the building of roads, aqueducts, buildings, things like that. And yet when they came in and took over where you were living, it wasn't necessarily a very pleasant experience, and it certainly wasn't for the Jews. And ultimately, it is the Roman Empire, the Roman authority that crucifies Jesus, had already, as he points out, crucified thousands of Jews at that point. It's a horrific form of public execution employed to dampen rebellion. And Jesus spoke of the way the world gives peace. The Pax Romana was the prime example at that time. And he offered his disciples a peace opposite to the peace that power enforces. The Pax Christi broke out precisely through the death of Jesus at Roman hands, and and yet the Pax Christi spread through the disciples' proclamation of his death in the face of Roman power, condemning the ruler of this world before the eyes of growing thousands, he says. And I found that interesting in light of several things. One of them being the fact that, this is many years before this happens, but eventually Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, the very empire that executed him. And it spread within the Roman Empire in ways that really were inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus. Certainly the Paul, Barnabas, others, spread Christianity through a missionary effort, and people converted to it, as we know, and including in Rome. You have the eventual conversion of Constantine. His conversion, though, wasn't, what he did with it was very militaristic and very much, he has the vision of the cross in the sky. By this sign you shall conquer. And of course, the empire didn't really convert permanently till I think one of the later emperors, and pagan worship was eventually outlawed. It wasn't just that everybody looked up one day and said, "Oh, Christianity's so great, let's just join up and stop practicing the religion that our ancestors have practiced for millennia here." Paganism was outlawed, and Christianity became a tool of the very empire that had executed Jesus. And I think many, particularly Protestants, would believe that kind of through this process and down through the centuries, the church fell into a kind of apostasy because of its association with the Roman Empire. And today, you may hear some theologians, particularly more progressive ones, talk about empire and how, a calling of Christians today to truly follow Jesus is to resist the concept of empire and the influence of empire. We're obviously not talking about the Roman Empire, but rather the concept of some of the very contemporary realities in our country and in the world that are promoting the same kind of power over institutions and so forth that probably if Jesus were alive today would be putting him to death today. And so that's where my mind went with that when he brought in the Pax Romana versus the Pax Christi idea, which is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I think it all kind of ties up in there a little bit together. At least it did in my mind. That part really stuck out to me.
You're muted again.
Sorry, I've been waiting all day for that phone call, so.
You got to take them when they come.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've been thinking, Jonathan, that where my reading at this point is taking me is in a slightly different direction, but it's not totally separated either. Is that I am reading an old book now, Matthew Fox's Original Blessing, and where it talks about right about the same time that the Pax Romana and all that stuff was happening and Christianity was becoming the state religion, was also when St. Augustine was introducing this idea of original sin and all of that. And the church went off in that direction because it was easier to maintain power if you believed in original sin. Whereas if you kept the more feminine, blessing kind of thing, it wasn't as easy to control people with. And it's a fascinating idea. The book was written originally in the 1980s, and I read part of it back then, but I just bought a new copy of it because I couldn't find my old copy, and am enjoying reading it. And it does cross paths with this book here at that point, I think. Somehow becoming the state religion was not necessarily a favor to Christianity or Christians either in the long run.
Mhm. Yeah, I think definitely it resulted in Christianity spreading. But then what kind of Christianity? A very, very much a top-down authoritarian kind of Christianity. What eventually became, or at that point, I guess, would have been what we would call and consider the Roman Catholic Church. And so that obviously was based out of Rome, concept of the papacy and all of that as that developed and solidified. And obviously, if one is a Roman Catholic, one would believe that probably is how things were intended to go. But I've always had a very difficult time accepting the idea that that would have been the intention of Jesus of Nazareth, to have, an imperial form of religion.
Right.
But there we are. That is, in fact, what occurred. So um, it would be interesting to see what would have happened. Maybe, and who knows, maybe we wouldn't even be sitting here talking about Christianity if that hadn't happened, because, it might have been relegated to the catacombs and everybody killed out and fed to
Right.
lions and so forth. And it would have been a curiosity of a particular historical period. So it's hard, I don't look at it so much as like I'm negatively judging it, as much as if this was the intention, that would seem surprising to me, and yet still clearly God used those mechanisms to bring about what took place. And I think that there are also there are things from what became institutional Christianity that I think have a great deal of value as well.
Mhm.
In terms of the traditions of the church, the liturgical seasons and things of that nature. So I don't think we can put it all in one basket, but it's certainly fascinating to look at what Christianity became versus what it was at the time we're talking about here. I think in the reflections from the Quaker tradition, he gives the example of the English Civil War and the failure of Parliament to grant the reforms that this gentleman, William Dewsbury, and others wanted. They learned, and the Quakers learned through the process of convincement, that true social transformation begins within and works from the grassroots up. And I think that that's definitely something that is a strength of Quakerism, is the idea of things originating inwardly, and through the inspiration of, inward inspiration of Christ and the Holy Spirit. And he just gives some accounts of the emerging Quaker movement and early friends calling their struggle the Lamb's War. And it was a nonviolent answer to the hollow victory of the Civil War, which had failed to produce the reforms that they were hoping to see. in their society. And so I think that it's interesting because you have a similar, it's analogous to what was going on at the time that we're talking about in Jesus' time. You're under Roman occupation. There were people advocating we need to militaristically overthrow the Romans. We're going to have to fight to make this happen. And that was not the way that Jesus went. Well, likewise, at the same time that there was social and there was societal tumult at the time of the early Friends, they also went in a direction of saying that any revolution, quote unquote, I guess, would be one that came from within and was a peaceful one brought about by transformation within individuals and by extension communities, larger society, but that shouldn't be a militaristic undertaking. He had an interesting note too in this section about the peaceable kingdom painting. He gives you a shot of that. And he talks about that the peaceable kingdom, the animals represent different personality types being reconciled with their opposites. Similar to the humors in medieval thought. And he goes through some of those. I thought that was an interesting section to this as well. And how these different animals represent things, like anger, and how these different aspects of the self need to be reconciled with one another. And there's a scene of friends with Native Americans in the background of the painting. And so I found this conversation to be interesting because you really can take the period of history when Jesus is living and what's happening there, see that reflected in the English Civil War, but you can also pull it forward and we could, I'm sure, see the same things reflected today. And so the point of that obviously being the timelessness of it and the fact that we can, there is nothing new under the sun, basically. The guided conversation, he talks about considering a matter that disturbs our peace of mind and something that we dread, or something occurring at present that's a crisis. And then, identifying what about that, what about it, the word that describes what blocks your way to peace. Why is it that way? And remember that Christ's way of teaching is teaching us is incarnational. It is beyond rational thought. He talks about becoming aware of peace and how it may be leading us to action, and ask Christ to continue leading you to the Father. So obviously, like all of the guided conversations, it's an interesting, meditation that you could do as an individual or even as a group. So I think that's obviously one of the good parts of this book.
I highlighted in the middle of that page 93 that Christ prepares a place for us, and I'm thinking of the places in the mansion that I'll go and prepare you a place. Christ prepares a place for us by preparing a place within us. I really like that.
Yeah, I like that idea too. It's obviously very central in Quakerism, other denominations of Christianity as well, but it certainly was not an idea that I was taught being raised as I was in the Church of Christ. There was very much an external understanding of everything. God is out there, Jesus is out there, very legalistic, rules-based, to do these things. You have to have all the right, ideas and things of that nature. That's why, to that point, going kind of looping back to when he had said that the idea of belief is trust, is the equivalent of trust, not an acceptance of particular ideas. And I think that would tie into that aspect that you pointed out, that it's an internal, very personal, inward experience. That's a very different idea than an understanding of Christianity that is more about externals. And I think that in Quakerism, it's talked about so commonly that it may be taken a little bit for granted that that's not necessarily how a lot of forms of the Christian religion historically or today have really languaged about that. Even evangelical Protestants who talk a lot about a personal relationship with Jesus, it still strikes me that a lot of that language is about an external situation. Like you may be having an inward experience, but you're still relating to something outside of yourself to a large extent. And so I think that's really valuable about Quakerism, really drawing everything. I feel like Quakerism always ends up pulling you back very much to that basic idea of the inward.
And the sentence that follows it, that as we live toward the best and sweetest of God's promises, impossible and otherworldly as they seem, something of that beauty grows within us. I like that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that's interesting in light of so many of the historical Quaker writings that talk about that very idea. And sometimes I get a little concerned about how in some forms of Quakerism today, I think there's a little bit of a will worship problem happening, where, as the historical friends would call it, where the inward light of Christ is really becoming associated with our own mind and our own willing and our own ability to bring about some of the beauty, it says, that grows within us. I think there are some tendencies pulling people in the direction that, well, that's something really you're doing, almost like it's self-help. It's some souped up self-help. And I think that sentence that you read, and talking about, the space being made within us, it's really not the individual doing that themselves. That's really the individual cooperating with the fact that God is doing that Christ is working that within the individual. And that's a very, very, very different idea than, I like the sound of, this, that, or the other spiritual discipline or spiritual practice. It's very easy for that to become egocentric, and become about the self. And it's really about, in my opinion, at least in my understanding, the extent to which we more or less get out of the way and allow that change to be brought about within us and worked within us. So yeah, some folks were doing a podcast, and they talked to me for the podcast, and they, Lakshmi and I think they're associated with Earlham School, maybe, and they're doing this project.
Is it the Quaker Speaks stuff that you're talking about? The
No,
podcast?
this will be
No.
for Western Yearly Meeting, I think, or FUM. I feel awful even bringing it up because of
Yes, Latchby's one of the interns, I think, that's working this summer
yeah.
or this
And
year.
so, what can
Right.
Quakerism do better, I think, was one of the questions. And I talked a little bit in no uncertain terms, kind of, about what I was just talking about. So it made me think of that too, because it's that tendency within some forms of the Religious Society of Friends, I find extremely concerning, that there's a move away from that sense of, we're not in charge of that process, and it's not going to happen because of our willing and our doing. It's really going to happen because of our surrendering.
Yeah, good point.
Okay. Any more thoughts on that?
Well, just going back to the thing I had mentioned a few weeks ago and that Sylvia alluded to earlier, I don't see, no, maybe I missed it, but I don't see where he deals with the part of the verse that says, the title is I'm the way, the truth, and the life, but I don't see where he talks about that second part of the sentence, no one comes to the Father but by me. And that's the part of the verse that I have struggled with as long as I can remember, but particularly after I lived overseas, and lived with people of a different faith and that kind of thing. And yet, I was at the point in time where I went to Ramallah, I was really struggling with the kind of Quakerism that I'd been raised with. That did not fit me, and was trying to find something. And I didn't, at that point, I didn't really care whether it was Quaker or not, but trying to find something else that fit me. And then I stumbled into the Earlham School of Religion and ended up staying there for a while. And that was a very good experience for a different reason. And then I ended up going to Ramallah and lived with the Muslims. And so many of my Muslim acquaintances there were what felt to me more Christian than a number of the Christians that I had encountered in the United States, who told me that if I didn't believe the way they did, that I was going to hell. And I didn't believe that either. But I have always struggled since then with, well, what about people of a different faith, or what about the people who lived before Jesus came? I don't believe that a loving creator would dump them all in whatever you want to describe as hell. I'm not sure I believe in that either, but would want to write off all of the population that lived prior to Jesus coming. And that was one of the things I was hoping that Doug would deal with in this chapter, is maybe not answer my questions, but at least kind of give me some guidance in how to think about that, new ways to think about that. And he didn't do that. Um, so I just need to keep looking for other places that will help me think about that. Um, Otherwise, I thought the chapter was really good, but I was disappointed in that sense that he didn't give me some stuff to at least think about in how to deal with that issue.
What if we go back kind of where we started this conversation in saying 2,000 years ago, what did people know about the world and other religions? When Jesus was coming, it was a whole new way he was introducing. And even Jesus may not have known about the globe, that the world was round, that there were many other peoples around the world. And maybe if we shrink the world to his world at that time, maybe what he said was, this is the only way. This is the God I know. This is the way he wants us to operate. And that's as big as the world was at that time.
Yeah, I think that is a useful way to look at it, and I've kind of done some of that on my own too. I just don't believe that something that a being that was big enough to create what we know of the world and all that would have made some decisions like this is the only way to go, and that sort of thing. So I've kind of on my own come to conclusions like what you're suggesting, Sylvia. I guess what I would kind of like to see is somebody that I consider to be a little smarter than me, give me some reason to believe that that's really true. I'm kind of in danger of doing what you were talking about, Jonathan, in that this is what makes sense to me. This is what feels good to me. So this is what's right, and that's okay. But I want to have it more grounded in what other people think and know and that kind of thing, rather than just this is my opinion and it makes me feel good, so I'm going to stick to it. Um, and that wasn't the purpose of the chapter, so I'll have to keep looking.
I think one way, that's something I've struggled with too. Having been raised in the church, I left the church and I explored and was involved with various non-Christian traditions, and certainly experienced truth in those traditions. which is its own story. But I bring that up to say a place that I've come to as, eventually finding my way back to the Christian faith. It's kind of a softer version, and I think we talked about this once before, of the C.S. Lewis take on it, which was that he said Christians aren't required to believe that other religions are false all the way through, but simply that they are less true than Christianity because they don't present the Christ, the means by which ultimate reconciliation with God for the individual and eventually the world is going to occur. I would kind of take that I'd maybe notch that down a little bit in intensity on my end of things and say that I would see it as, if you go with the first chapter of John, in the beginning was the Word, the Quaker Gospel, and the idea that Jesus of Nazareth, to whatever extent you believe this was the case, was the Logos, the Word incarnate. That's ultimate truth. That's the eternal mind of God. That's the living essence of God being made known in the world. So that wherever you would encounter truth, even if it's not wearing the label of what we regard as Christianity, it's still truth and ultimately still Christ, the Christ spirit, that essence of truth. And that's not to say that all the places you would find that in terms of other religions are the same as Christianity. Clearly they're not. We could go through the list of things that conflict with Christianity and Buddhism or whatever. But that's kind of the way that I have come to see it, is that truth is truth, maybe no matter what we're linguistically labeling it as. But I do think that in human epics and times and places, truth has been more fully revealed than at others. And I think I would maintain at this point that I think probably the level of truth revealed through Christ would be a fuller truth in terms of forwarding the project of human reconciliation with God than a religion like so many Quakers love Buddhism. More so liberal friends love them some Buddhism. If you go to a liberal friends meeting, there's going to be somebody talking about the Buddha before you get out the door. And that fascinates me because Buddhism is atheistic. It's not, there's no, and they say that the self is an illusion. So you certainly can look at a religion like that and say, there's a lot of truth here. Mindfulness, the focus on the value of all life, all the things. But at the end, you're eventually going to kind of have to come up against the wall as to whether here in the West we're saying the self is an illusion and whether or not there's a God, whether or not there's a personal God. You can't reconcile those two things. And there's a lot of people that are basically saying, oh yeah, this is all the same. I find that frustrating because it's like you must not know much about one of these two things, because we need to be true to both. We need to let them be what they truly are and respect both of them fully, I guess is what I'm saying. So with the Islam example, to engage with Islam is what it truly is, and the depth of what it is, and the truth that you can experience within that, and that millions and millions of people do. Are we prepared to say that that's an equivalent truth to what was revealed through Christ? That's each person's individual determination to be made, I think. I myself would say it is not, because there are things in Islam that I would find very problematic. But that's not the same thing as saying Islam is a false religion, or that somebody practicing it is castigated to eternal torment, or it's not even to say that there was no inspiration behind Muhammad's teaching. Who am I to say that there may have been a need at that time and place for that, that teaching. And yet at the same time, I can also use my intellect and look at that religion and say, not so sure that some of what you're bringing to the table would be consistent with my understanding of truth. I don't know if all that made any sense, but I guess ultimately it's for each to determine the extent of truth. when we encounter it, where the boundaries of truth lie in terms of religions and, well, really anything in life, I suppose, that
Yeah.
we're
Well,
encountering.
I think there's merit in what both you and Sylvia have said, and though they're kind of places that I have arrived at, sort of, or have been thinking about, um, along the way. Um, living in the, as we all do, in the middle of very evangelical world. My faith doesn't lend itself to sound bites as much as a lot of other people's do. And so I find myself feeling like I'm, just standing there with my mouth hanging open, not knowing what to say, sort of thing. I'm not really looking for a soundbite answer to this, because my faith is bigger than that, and I can see bigger than that. But there are times when a soundbite would come in really handy. Yeah, and I haven't found that one yet. So I'll keep looking.
Have either of you read the Barbara Brown Taylor book called Holy Envy?
I love Barbara Brown Taylor. She is so cool.
Uh,
Yes, I've read it. It's been a while, but I have read it.
Finding God in the faith of others.
Oh, no, I've not.
No,
I need to go back
it's
and read
worth
it.
it. And it's an easy read. It's not as not as difficult to understand, but
What, Barbara Brown Taylor?
Just Google her and maybe you'll be given some podcast or presentation she's done before, because she's a dynamic speaker as well as a writer, and she's a fireball, but she's a professor and teaches world religions and takes her students to worship in these different forms, different places. And they come away saying, I wish our religion would be like that part of that religion.
Yeah. I'll have to check her workout. Yeah. I think that it would be great if, and I said this the other day, so I'll be repeating myself for anyone who listens to what I said in the other thing, but that, Quakers probably need to be able to explain what Quakerism is in less than 30 minutes. But I don't think it needs to be brought down to 30 seconds either. Like, hopefully we could get somewhere in the median range, because this is really complex. It's simplistic in a lot of ways, but it's very complex at the same time. And I think that that's just when you're dealing with the realm of things that are beyond the human. And I think that the experiences of other religions, I think that Christians would do very well to have more of those, non-Christian religions specifically. Because there's a whole lot of people out there that are pursuing non-Christian spirituality and religion today because of the ways in which traditional Christianity has failed to speak to them.
Right.
And I think that there's some very good reasons for those. And I'm one of those people that for many years, that was true of me. And I sought out truth elsewhere because it was not, Christianity wasn't doing such a great job. And so I think that there's a lot to learn from other faith communities and other traditions, without saying everything is the same. That's my only gripe. People that tend to go exploring other religions, they tend to want to come home and say it's all, we're all doing the same thing. It's like, I don't know about that, but I don't think we all have to be.
We do say we all read the same book, but there sure are differences in the way we interpret it.
Right, absolutely. And hey, maybe that's the mini mansions concept too, because God knows I don't have all the answers. Let's see here. We've got a little less than 10 minutes. Do we want to go on to conversation 10 and try to dig around in that a little bit?
Sure.
Sure, why not?
Okay. Conversation 10 is entitled Friends. So you have a shift to Christ speaking through rather than to the disciples. He talks about the conversation between Jesus and his disciples becomes our conversation with Jesus. True life being the idea of abiding in Christ, who is the true vine symbolism that we find. He goes into that about the pruning of branches, the metaphor of that, implying that Christian life um, has its rigors. Growth in Christ involves hardship and loss and periods of darkness. I think that's a huge topic. I mean, entire writings exist about, the dark night of the soul idea. And then, of course, we were talking a moment ago, too, about, what really can you expect from a religion whose founder, ended up crucified, who was very much countercultural. If you decide you're going to go in those footsteps, you're probably going to encounter some of the same problems that he and other people who followed him, what they encountered, and that's not going to necessarily be pleasant. And I think sometimes people take that on the like martyrdom level. I'm thinking more in terms, to jump ahead to some Quaker related material, the refiner's fire concept that you encounter in Quaker writings, the idea it's a real nobody gets out of this alive type thing. When you open up to these influences, you open up to things spiritual, and you start to work with that concept we were talking about of the inward light of Christ guiding, making space within you, etc. There's serious consequences for that, in terms of challenging your priors, who you thought you were, what you thought was right, what you thought you should be doing, what your ego was showing you, what your culture was showing you, your family, maybe what the church was showing you. And you start being molded, and that's all being kind of burnt away, using the fire symbolism or the pruning symbolism. There's nothing safe about that, for the individual. Never mind, the fear of being martyred or something, fed to the lions, probably not necessarily what we have to worry about today, but some real blows to our own ego, and that inward sense of ourselves being laid low, I think, is what's being talked about there, and that can lead to a period of darkness and dark nights of the soul, the things that happen to us in human life as well. So I think that that's a maybe not the most uplifting component of this, but it's a realistic one. And I think it's important for people. I think it's important to talk about that probably more than we do, because you can't cope with what you don't acknowledge. And we're all going to have that pruning process. The disciples are Jesus' friends because he's revealed to them that what the Father has revealed to him. But they must do what he's commanded them, to abide in his teachings. Central to this is the commandment to love. And I guess this is also the, if you are my friend, I will call you my friends if you do as I commanded. So that's how we get the religious society of friends. Let's see. Deep friendships and relationships are born as we are joined together in the vine that is Christ. I think, again, we're getting more language here that's like post earthly, physically alive Jesus, and more we're getting into material dealing with the spiritual Jesus, the resurrected Christ that's present to be a reality and a teaching one at that, continuing to teach and reveal truth as he did during his physical life. And I think I put the example, I wrote down the example of a covered meeting, and I don't know if that's something he said or if that made me think of the covered meeting, but whoever thought of it, I made a note of the concept of a covered meeting in Quakerism, and the idea that in a moment like that, you can really, I think, if you think of it in terms of the vine connotation that he's talking about here, you can see what that you can tie those in together. If you're have the experience of a covered meeting, there's a oneness that's happening there that's on a spiritual level, and I think that's a Quaker take on that same concept, that everybody is a part of the same vine. And those kinds of spiritual experiences that we can have in a communal context really drives that home. The guided conversation focuses on abiding with Christ in the center of our being. And then he brings up bringing to mind a close friend. what their relationship with you means to you, kind of holding them in the light kind of situation with what's your desire for them, what do they need. Consider that Christ died to free them from delusion and sin. Christ lays down his life for you by patiently abiding in you. What kindness or practical help are you being led toward regarding your friend? So again, that shifting a little bit toward the other from the self, I think was a good component of this conversation. I think it's very easy for things spiritual to get focused on the self quite a bit. And at the end of the day, a huge part of what Christ taught was, loving the other, loving your neighbor as yourself, and being part of something that's larger than just it's me and Jesus. That you sometimes get that in some of modern Christianity, the idea that it's just like this totally individual project that you're on. And it's really not about that. It's about a communal experience. It's about other people of whom you are just one. So.
CHIASM. How do you say that? CH.
Ism?
Yeah.
Page
Yeah.
97.
Uh-huh.
I would pronounce it chiasm, but that doesn't mean that's the right way.
Let's look here. Oh, chiasm. Okay, yeah.
Okay, a K sound.
Chiasm.
Stochastic patterns. Oh, yeah, I remember this. I'd never heard of it until
That was new to me. Mm-hmm.
I never had either. Well, I have to admit, when I read through it, I mean, his explanation on page 98, it's been a while since I read it, but it didn't always click with me that they were exactly the same and flipped. I didn't always see the correlation,
Mm-hmm.
but I'd never heard of that linguistic technique or whatever it is that you call them.
And it's the comment on the last paragraph that the book of Revelation is structured chiastically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he talks about that the texts like the Gospel of John were typically heard rather than read, because many people were illiterate and copies of the Gospels were rare. And so I guess this device made it more likely that hearing it's going to stick, because it's more likely to, the way it kind of lines up, I guess, and pairs up, it's reinforcing, mutually reinforcing. But yeah, I had never heard of that, never was totally unfamiliar with that idea and the term.
On 99 in the middle of the second paragraph, but the literary structure serves to highlight the spiritual truth of abiding in Christ. Just say it over and over again if you're abiding in Christ.
I think we sometimes forget that the people that were hearing this didn't read. And so it makes a difference in how I read it. If I remember that it was all oral tradition, and there are things like this chiastic literary style that were used to help people play those mental games that they needed to play in order to remember the concepts that were the most important.
I had a professor that called it purposeful redundancy.
That's good.
Yeah. Yeah, that does make sense, because I think we take so for granted, oh, let me write that down, and you grab a pen or your notes on your phone. And yet in this time, to be able to read wasn't even necessarily to be able to write. Those were two different skills, and you certainly didn't have, not everyone had a stack of like papyrus handy that they were just like writing on. I
That's
mean, it was
right.
rare to have documents. And in the synagogues, not all of the synagogues would have had the same scrolls available to them. When Jesus goes into the synagogue to read, he might have gone to a different synagogue and had different scrolls. There wasn't like this fixed canon of scriptures. So I think it's wild to think of that, but it's definitely a very, as you said, it's a different world where people, you had to retain, and they had a greater familiarity with remembering things and committing things to memory than we do now. And so these stories were passed orally before they were written down. And it's astounding that how consistently they were told, and how they were told in different places consistently. And that's quite a lot. That's an achievement, to say the least, for these stories. And they made such an impression that people told them and told them and told them before they were put down to paper. Well, not even paper, vellum or whatever. So I think that is an interesting piece to bring into it too, is that it was an oral tradition.
I think that, and your comment earlier, Sylvia, is still kind of knocking around in my head too, about thinking of the fact that Jesus did know everything. We talk about God knowing everything and blah 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 and all this, but Jesus didn't know what was going to happen now. He was talking in this world to these people with this mindset that he had, and I don't always remember that when I read the Bible, and that kind of thing. So keeping that in mind, and the fact that this was all an oral tradition for centuries, are two really helpful little tidbits to keep in the back of our minds as we're reading the Bible, I think.
My siblings and I get together every Sunday afternoon on a Zoom call, and we often talk about things that happened when we were kids, and we don't remember it the same way at all. We were all there.
Right.
And there are only four of us, and we have the same problem, the same challenge.
These oral traditions aren't are probably always accurate either.
That's right.
And it makes me think of what you were saying about him not knowing everything, is that even though he's preparing in these texts the disciples for the fact he's going to be taken, executed, all that, he still prays that not happen to him. And that always interested, even as a child, I would look at that and think, like, if he knew this was coming and it had to happen, there was still humanness at work there, just to literally pray with the sweat drops of blood fall. Like, that's stress. That's being that is being ill with fear and stress, and that's as human as it can get. And I think that's a fascinating idea too, is that he not only didn't know everything, even if as you're going in the story and he's telling everybody this is coming, it has to happen, this is the way it has to go. You still had the "why hast thou forsaken me" and all that, and that's a lot to kind of get your head around too. I think, as far as it's not contradictory to me. It's just there's a lot more humanness there than I think sometimes we allow for.
Right. Right. It's been a good discussion. This is fun.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Well,
Yes.
thank you both for participating. And I think we've got 3 conversations left, 11, 12, and I think there's 13. And so I suppose we'll get together in January.
No, I think his takes on the people, the last 3 are about people and in the story, and I think those were really interesting too. This book has grown on me, I have to say. When I first started reading it, I thought, "Oh my gosh, this this is so heavy. It's like being back at ESR or worse," and that was a year or 2 ago. And but it's through our conversations and things like that, it has grown on me a lot. I really appreciate the conversations. I hope that when we're finished with this book that we'll pick up something else and continue the habit. That's one of the drawbacks that I see to being an online only worship group is the only time that right now that we spend together consistently is 45 minutes on Sunday morning. And I hope that we can try in this new year to find ways to continue spending more time with each other and getting better acquainted.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, that'd be good. Jonathan, Dan and I will be in Belize, January and February, and I'm coming home at the end of February, but Dan's staying 3 more weeks.
Oh, wow.
I'll be in Mooresville that 3 weeks, so hope to get to visit with some of my friends, Lynn. Mhm.
Sounds good. When is that you're going to be back, you say?
I'm coming back on the 28th of February.
Okay,
Mhm. And
great.
then Dan's coming, I think, on the 21st of March.
Okay.
And I'm supposed to be on a panel of women for the Quaker lecture for William Penn University,
Oh, cool.
funded by the Bean family. I'm not sure how I got to be chosen, but
Who are the other women?
well, I don't even know them. They're
Oh, okay.
yeah. The topic is women in leadership of religious organizations.
Oh, cool. Interesting.
So we'll see how that goes.
Great.
Mhm.
Well, remind us when you're back and
Okay.
together.
I'll be coming back on the 28th of February. I don't know, may have to sleep at the airport. Plane comes in really late. I don't know who's gonna pick us up at the airport at that time of night, but we'll see.
Well, and we'll see each other all with Brent tomorrow evening. Talk about clerkship.
Okay.
So
Yes.
sounds good. Bye, Jet. It's good to see you too.
She crawled down a little while when she was on my shoulder, and she just clawed me as she came down, and I tried to not
Ooh.
scream as it happened. I was like, it's time for you to get down. Like you've contributed just plenty in the book group by
Little jealous of your attention, maybe, huh?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, who are you talking to? You're not talking to me.
Yeah, she wasn't a fan. So
Okay.
We'll see you tomorrow night.
All right.
good evening. Bye.
Bye.